They laughed when she picked up the rifle, until the Duke saw her defeat every nobleman. The frost had come early to Harcourt Estate that year, and so had the Duke's cruelty. The morning air hung like a blade across the south lawn. 23 members of England's most decorated peerage stood in their finest wool, breath-curling white into the grey sky, assembled for the Duke Freeman's annual marksmanship exhibition. The only morning of the year when titles were supposedly set aside and skill alone was meant to be king. Supposedly. Duke Nolan Freeman stood at the head of the assembly like a man who had been born knowing exactly where to stand. Dark coat, silver buttons, the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from control. He surveyed the frozen range with pale, calculating eyes, and the lords around him bent subtly in his direction, not bowing, exactly. Simply, yielding. The way flame leans away from wind. He had not yet spoken this morning and already the day belonged to him. Welcome to Forbidden Diaries. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Essie Haynes was not supposed to be standing anywhere near that lawn. She was the daughter of Harcourt's head groom, a girl who had grown up between stables and silences, who knew the weight of a saddle before she knew the weight of a compliment, and who had, for the entirety of her 22 years, been expertly invisible to people like Duke Nolan Freeman. She carried trays. She held horses. She stood at edges. She was furniture that occasionally breathed. And yet there she was, standing at the edge of the frozen gravel path, watching Lord Carrington, third attempt, third failure, miss the clay target at 500 yards for the third consecutive time. The lords murmured polite disappointment. The Duke said nothing. His silence, she had long observed, was louder than any man's applause. 500 yards, she said. Quietly, to no one in particular. But the morning was very still. 15 heads turned. A few of the ladies near the terrace glanced up. Lord Carrington, still holding the rifle, looked at her the way one looks at furniture that has, inexplicably, spoken. Duke Freeman turned last. Slowly. The way a man turns when he is not surprised, only deciding how to be annoyed. Is there something you wish to add, girl, or are you simply in the habit of attending gatherings to which you were not invited? Essie met his eyes. The peerage went very, very quiet. The wind shifted at half range, she said. He was correcting for the wrong variable. That's all. A beat. Then laughter. The particular kind that well-dressed people produce when they wish to make a person feel small without the inconvenience of cruelty. The Duke did not laugh. He studied her with the expression of a man who has just noticed something under his boot and is determining whether to step around it or through it. Then perhaps, he said, each word deliberate as a chess move, you would care to demonstrate. The wager, spoken before witnesses. Strike the target at 500 yards and you may name any condition you wish upon this estate. Miss it, and you, your father, and every horse he tends leave Harcourt before nightfall. Permanently. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way men say things when they are absolutely certain the other person will refuse, or fail, or both. Essie looked at the rifle in Lord Carrington's hands. Then at the distant white clay disc, half invisible in the pale autumn light. Then at the Duke, who was already half turned back toward his assembly, the matter already concluded in his mind. She stepped forward and held out her hand. The rifle was heavier than it looked. Lord Carrington surrendered it with the barely concealed smirk of a man handing a drowning woman an anchor. Essie took it without flinching, both hands, steady, the walnut stock settling against her palm like something she had always known how to hold. It was a custom piece, she could tell immediately. Longer barrel than standard. Heavier charge. Built for a man of the Duke's precise, unforgiving temperament. Built, in other words, to punish imprecision. She did not raise it yet. Around her, the peerage had arranged itself into a theatre of contempt. She heard it in the murmurs, low, amused, the comfortable cruelty of people who have never had to be competent because they have always simply been wealthy. Someone near the terrace laughed softly. A gloved hand covered a smile. Duke Nolan Freeman stood apart from all of it, arms clasped behind his back, watching her with the still, airless patience of a man who has already written the ending. Essie felt the wind. Not metaphorically. Literally. A ghost of pressure against her left cheek, shifting, inconsistent, arriving in soft pulses from the northwest and dying before it reached the range marker. This was what Lord Carrington had missed. Not skill. Not courage. Simply attention. She raised the rifle. Aligned the sight. Let her breath slow to almost nothing. That particular interior quiet her father had taught her at age 9, standing in a frozen field not unlike this one. She waited for the wind to pause. It did. She fired. The crack split the morning open. 500 yards away, the clay disc did not chip or graze or wobble off its mount. It exploded, a clean, total obliteration, a small white cloud dissolving into the pale autumn air as though it had never existed at all. The lawn fell into a silence so complete, Essie could hear the frost settling. She lowered the rifle, turned, and for the first time that morning, looked Duke Nolan Freeman directly in the eye. He had not moved. But something behind his expression, some small, load-bearing certainty, had quietly, irreversibly shifted. Nobody moved. That was the remarkable thing. 23 members of the peerage, men who commanded estates, armies, parliamentary votes, stood on that frostbitten lawn and did absolutely nothing, because they were all waiting for the same thing. They were waiting to see what Duke Nolan Freeman would do with the wager he had lost. This was the moment, Essie understood, that separated men of rank from men of character. Status was easy to wear when it cost nothing. The question was what a man reached for when his pride and his word pulled in opposite directions. The Duke had not moved from his position. His expression had not changed, not visibly. And yet the assembly watched him with the particular breathless attention of people who sense, without being able to name it, that something historic is unfolding in the space between one man's silence and his next word. Lord Carrington cleared his throat. Someone near the back murmured something that dissolved before it became a sentence. A lady in grey looked studiously at her gloves. Duke Freeman walked forward. Not quickly. Not with ceremony. With the same measured, unhurried authority he brought to every movement, as though the ground beneath him existed purely as a courtesy. He stopped 2 feet from Essie Haynes, close enough that the assembled peerage could hear every word, and looked at her with eyes that gave away nothing except, perhaps, the faintest trace of something he had not expected to feel. Respect. The wager stands, he said. His voice carried across the lawn without effort, cold and precise as the shot itself. Miss Haynes has demonstrated a flawless command of this range under conditions that defeated every man present. The terms were clear. They will be honored. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Then he turned, clasped his hands behind his back, and walked toward the manor as though the matter was settled. Because, for a man like Duke Nolan Freeman, it now was. Behind him, the peerage exhaled as one. Essie did not exhale. She was already thinking about what she intended to ask for. He found her an hour later in the third stall from the end. The stables at Harcourt were warmer than the manor in the way that lived-in places always are, heated not by fireplaces but by the slow, steady breath of animals and the accumulated warmth of daily purpose. It smelled of hay and leather and the particular earthiness that no amount of aristocratic renovation could domesticate. Duke Nolan Freeman stood at the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, before he located Essie Haynes at the far end, running a cloth along the flank of a grey mare with the unhurried focus of someone who had already put the morning's events behind her. She did not turn when she heard his footsteps. She knew who it was. "You came to thank me," she said, "or to take it back." The Duke stopped walking. In 20 years of commanding rooms, boardrooms, and battlefields, very few people had spoken to him before he had decided to be spoken to. He found, to his own considerable irritation, that he did not entirely hate it. "Neither," he said. She turned then, not sharply, not with performance, just the natural pivot of a woman who had decided the horse could wait. She looked at him the way she had looked at the target, directly, without apology, calculating something he could not name. "Then you came to understand how it was done," she said. "Which means you already know the answer wasn't the rifle." A lesser man would have bristled. Duke Freeman simply studied her, This woman in a worn work coat standing in a horse stall, speaking to him with the undecorated confidence of someone who had never needed a title to know her own worth. There was no performance in her. No calculation of how to be palatable. She was simply, entirely, herself, and the contrast with every conversation he had endured that morning was so stark it was almost physically uncomfortable. "You could have refused the wager," he said finally. "Not an accusation. Almost a question." "So could you," Essie replied. "You didn't. Neither did I. The difference is you expected me to fail, and I expected me to win. That is not arrogance, Your Grace. That is simply knowing the difference between what you have been told you are and what you actually are." The mare shifted quietly in her stall. Outside, the frost was beginning to soften at the edges as the afternoon light found its angle. Duke Nolan Freeman stood in the dim warmth of the stables and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he had walked into a room and met someone more interesting than himself. He did not apologize for the morning. She did not ask him to. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. Each time with a different pretext. A question about the mare's left foreleg, a comment about the condition of the range, once an entirely unconvincing inquiry about the provenance of the rifle's barrel. Essie answered each question honestly and said nothing about the ones he wasn't asking. She had grown up around animals. She understood that the ones carrying the most weight approached the water slowly. It was on the third morning that he finally stopped pretending. "Every man on that lawn has been shooting since boyhood," he said, without preamble, leaning against the stable door with his arms crossed, a posture she suspected he believed looked casual. "They have had the finest instruction money can commission. And yet you, with no formal training, read conditions that not one of them considered. I would like to understand why." Essie set down the bridle she was mending and looked at him with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. "They were taught to control the shot," she said. "I was taught to understand it. There is a difference, Your Grace, between a man who commands a room and a man who reads one. Your lords walked onto that range and tried to impose their will on the wind. I simply listened to what it was already telling me." Something crossed his face, quick, unguarded, gone before he could retrieve it. She pressed forward, because she had not survived 22 years at the edges of power by failing to recognize the exact moment a door opened. "That is your trouble as well, if you'll permit me to say so." His eyes narrowed. Not with anger, with the particular sharp attention of a man who has just heard something he did not expect and is not yet certain whether it is an insult or diagnosis. "You have spent your entire life," Essie continued, her voice steady and unhurried, "commanding things into order. Your estate, your title, the people in every room you enter. And it works, because everyone around you has agreed to be commanded. But that is not mastery, Your Grace. That is simply fear wearing a very expensive coat. Real mastery begins the moment you stop trying to control what you don't yet understand and start learning to listen to it instead." The stable was very quiet. The grey mare exhaled softly. Duke Nolan Freeman uncrossed his arms. He looked at the ground for a moment, just a moment, in the way of a man privately dismantling something he had spent decades constructing. When he raised his eyes again, 2 words came out of him that, Essie suspected, had never in his life been directed at someone of her standing. "Teach me." Essie Haynes held his gaze for a long, level moment. Then she picked up the bridle, returned to her work, and said simply, "Tomorrow, dawn. Bring the rifle and leave the title at the door." He was there before her. Essie had not expected that. She had half anticipated the Duke arriving late, or not at all, having spent the night reconstructing his pride from whatever she had left of it. Instead she found him standing alone on the frostbitten South Range in the grey pre-dawn, the custom rifle held loosely at his side, his breath rising white in the cold morning air. No attendants. No title. Just a man and a weapon and the particular stillness of someone who has made a quiet, private decision. She said nothing about it. She simply walked past him toward the range markers and began to read the morning. "The light comes from the east at this hour," she said, without turning. "Which means the ground to the north is still fully frozen. The air above it sits lower, denser. Wind will hug the left side of the range until the sun clears the tree line. If you aim true center at this hour, you will always pull left. Not because your form is wrong. Because you are not accounting for the world as it actually is. She heard him step forward. Felt him come to stand beside her, close enough to follow her eye line, far enough to maintain the last inch of the distance he had not yet decided to surrender. You read all of that, he said, from the frost. I read all of that from 22 years of paying attention to things no one thought I was important enough to notice. She finally turned and looked at him. That is your first lesson, your grace. Everything speaks. Most people simply choose who they are willing to hear it from. She held the rifle out to him. He took it. And this time, she watched him feel the weight differently. Not as an instrument of dominance. As a question he did not yet know how to answer. Raise it, she said. But do not aim. Not yet. Just hold it and listen to what the morning is telling you. Duke Nolan Freeman raised the rifle. And for the first time in his life, he did not immediately try to fire. He missed. Not by much. And that, Essie knew, was the dangerous part. A wide miss was easy to learn from. A near miss was the kind of thing a proud man could convince himself was almost a success. And pride dressed up as progress was the most stubborn obstacle she had ever tried to teach around. Duke Freeman lowered the rifle. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man practicing the discipline of not reacting. She had seen that expression before, on her father, on the older groomsmen, on every person who had spent a lifetime performing composure for an audience that never asked whether the performance was costing them anything. The wind changed, he said. Yes, Essie replied. At the last moment. Yes. Then the miss was not entirely. He stopped. Something in her expression, patient and entirely without mercy, closed that sentence before he could finish it. The wind changing is not bad luck, she said. It is information. It was always going to change. The question was whether you were paying attention closely enough to feel it before your finger moved. You weren't. Not because you lack skill. Because the moment before you fired, you stopped listening and started wanting. And wanting blinds you to what is. He was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere in the tree line a bird shifted, and the sound of it was very clear in the cold air. You are saying the fear of missing caused the miss, he said slowly. I am saying the need to succeed is not the same thing as the willingness to understand, Essie said. Fear is not your enemy, your grace. Ignored, it destroys your aim. Understood, it tells you exactly where your attention has gone thin. It is not a weakness to be conquered. It is a variable to be read, like the wind, like the frost, like everything else on this range that you have spent your life trying to command rather than comprehend. He looked at the distant range marker for a long time. Then he raised the rifle again. This time his breathing slowed before his finger moved. This time he waited, not with impatience, but with the particular quality of attention that has finally stopped arguing with the world and started listening to it. The shot was clean. He did not celebrate. Neither did she. They both understood something had shifted that had nothing to do with marksmanship. They walked back to the manor in silence, the comfortable kind, not the loaded kind. The sun had cleared the tree line by now and the frost was pulling back from the grass in slow retreat, and the estate looked, in this particular light, less like a monument to inherited power and more like simply a place where people lived. It was the Duke who spoke first. My mother used to come to this range, he said, with the careful flatness of someone delivering information they have not decided yet whether to feel. Before she was ill. She was a better shot than my father ever was, though he was not the sort of man who found that easy to say aloud. Essie said nothing. She had learned that some confidences needed walking room, not response. She told me once that the estate would outlast every argument I ever had with it. A pause. I did not understand what she meant until this morning. He stopped walking. They were at the edge of the south garden now, the manor rising behind him, every window of it glinting coldly in the early light. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has owned his entire life and is only now, slowly, beginning to see. I have spent 34 years performing the role of this place, he said. The title, the composure, the absolute authority, and I have been very good at it. He turned to look at her, not with a calculating assessment of the man on the lawn 3 mornings ago, but with something rawer. But I have not, I think, had a single conversation in the last decade that cost me anything. Everything has been surface. Perfectly arranged, perfectly hollow. Essie met his gaze steadily. That is what happens, she said, when you build a world so ordered that nothing unexpected can enter it. Nothing unexpected. Nothing real. He nodded. Once, slow, the way of a man accepting a verdict he has already privately reached. I want a different world, he said. Not dramatically. Simply, the way people say true things when they have finally stopped dressing them up. A smaller one, perhaps. But one that is actually mine. Essie looked at the manor, then back at him. The morning was fully open now, the light clean and honest across the lawns. Then we have more work to do, she said, and walked on ahead of him toward the door. They laughed when she picked up the rifle. Until the Duke saw her defeat every nobleman. He made the offer 3 days later, in the estate's east study, at a writing desk covered in the kind of official correspondence that runs a dukedom. Essie stood across from him. Not summoned, she had made that quietly clear when the footman came, but arrived of her own choosing, which was a different thing entirely. The room smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the faint mineral sharpness of ink. Morning light fell across the desk in long, level bars. It was the kind of room built to remind visitors of the distance between themselves and the man seated inside it. It did not work on Essie Haynes. I would like to offer you a permanent position on the estate, Duke Freeman said. He had the manner of a man who had rehearsed the words and was now discovering they sounded different aloud than they had in his head. Not as a stable hand. A formal appointment, with appropriate compensation, your own quarters in the East Wing, and full authority over the training range. Essie was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, considering. There was a difference she had always understood and that he was only now beginning to. I will accept, she said, on one condition. He waited. She noticed he had stopped reaching for authority like a reflex. Progress. The lessons continue, she said. Not only the shooting. All of it. Reading the land, reading conditions, learning to sit with uncertainty long enough to understand it rather than override it. That work is not finished. It has barely begun. And I will not take a title or a room in the East Wing only to become another piece of furniture that is paid to agree with you. Something moved across Duke Freeman's face that, on another man, might have been a smile. On him it was subtler, a slight easing at the edges, the expression of a man who has just received exactly the answer he was hoping for and is too well trained to show it. Agreed, he said. He stood and extended his hand across the writing desk, not downward, the way the powerful extend hands to the lesser, but level, straight across, the way one extends a hand to an equal. Essie looked at it for one measured moment. Then she stepped forward and took it. The handshake was firm and brief and meant everything. Outside the study window, the south range lay quiet in the early light. Frost still clinging to the far grass, the clay target mount standing empty, the whole long stretch of it waiting. It was, Essie thought, the same range it had always been. The same 500 yards. The same unpredictable wind. Only the people standing beside it had changed. And that, she had always known, was the only thing that ever needed to. And that air is where we leave Essie Haynes and Duke Nolan Freeman. A woman who walked onto a frostbitten lawn with nothing but competence, and walked away having changed a man that an entire peerage could not move. If this story moved you, if Essie's quiet, unshakable dignity hit the way it was meant to, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell, so the next story finds you the moment it drops. More stories like this one are coming. You don't want to miss them.